Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we venture forth into the middle of nowhere, for horrors that can only be found in the most remote of places. So get comfortable, and let the darkness take control. When we were little, my father, who was in the army for 18 years, used to tell us true stories about him and his fellow army members. One of them happened in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. There was one occasion where my father and his friend were in a camp on duty in the middle of nowhere, when they hear a woman's voice outside the camp. My father and his friend were scared, as well as curious, because the nearest town was 50 miles away. Anyway, they went outside and asked the lady if everything was all right. She said that she was lost and needed something to eat and drink. My father invited her inside and gave her food and water. After she finished the food, she asked my father if he was local. My father told her that he was from West Pakistan, and he was there for training only. She asked my father if he would like some local homemade sweets. My father said yes, and she left. A couple of days went by, and my father forgot about the incident. And after a few days, when my father and his friend were sleeping in the tent, they heard the same woman's voice again. This time, in different clothes, and she was wearing perfume. Her hair was wet, and looked like she'd just taken a shower and got ready. It looked like she hadn't walked the 50 miles to get there. My father invited her again inside and gave her water. This time she refused the water and gave my father a tray with a piece of cloth on it. When my father took the cloth from there were some handmade sweets as she had promised. The sweets were still warm and felt like someone had just made them. After a while she left and promised to return soon. According to my father, she started coming there every day with the same sweets. One day, she asked my father and his friend if they were married. My father lied to her and told her that he was happily married, but my father's friend told her that he was not. She asked him if he would like to marry her. My father's friend said no, after which she got angry and told them that they were just wasting her time and that they would regret it. After that, she never came back. And after a few days, my father and his friend finished their training and left camp. When they reached the nearest town, they asked the locals about this woman. Locals told them that they knew no one with that name or description that lived in the town, and the nearest town after that was at least a few hundred miles away. After that, my father left the area and went back to his home in West Pakistan. To this day, my father wondered about that woman and wants to know who she was and where she was coming from. I am a biologist and have done a fair amount of field work in Chile over the past 2 years, along with a friend/colleague. One long trip together, and 2 shorter solo trips each. We both had our share of close calls and whoa, universe moments. Things like volcanoes erupting that we'd previously been to or next to. Earthquakes, tsunamis, fires, floods, all narrowly missed. And more recently, the rains in the north of the country, which have washed out nearly entire villages that we've stopped for lunch in or camped just outside of. By far, the closest call was a mudslide that buried a road leading up into the mountain, one that we intended to take on that same day. Luckily, but seemingly not so at the time, we had some tire trouble involving both a flat tire and a punctured spare. So we wound up being delayed by half a day or more. When we finally got up that way, the road was impassable, but the slide had only just happened a couple of hours earlier. On the creepier side of things, there are loads of abandoned places in the Atacama Desert. Before the Haber process was developed, there was a huge nitrate industry in northern Chile. But when it collapsed, all the pampas were closed and abandoned, and are now slowly crumbling away. One abandoned village we came across looked especially old, almost like a little Fort Build on a rocky outcrop. There are these half tumbleweed of mortared boulders that I guess used to be living quarters or storage areas, and inside of them we found the headless carcass of a guanaco, a wild cousin of the llama, mummified by the dry climate. The creepiness level is helped by the fact that the setting is literally the closest thing to Mars on Earth. But more importantly, where did the head go? I also spent an afternoon at an abandoned tourist site where there are some awesome Incan petroglyphs. The visitor centre evidently closed years ago due to lack of tourists. The roof was caved in, paint chippings all over, and weeds were growing inside. There are signs all around the site though to explain the petroglyphs, but they're all sun-faded and bent and rusting away. The place has a serious Fallout vibe, simultaneously super creepy and really awesome. It was just super eerie, because here I was discovering it for the first time, but it was so neglected and forgotten. As for a scary animal encounter, Chile's wildlife is pretty harmless in general. They have pumas, but they're shy of people and seldom seen, and we never encountered any. Well, on one of his solo trips, my buddy was camping at a favourite spot right down on the shore next to the ocean, secluded. We both stopped there several times before because of how nice it was. On this occasion, he got there after dark, set up, had dinner, and went to sleep as usual. In the morning, while packing up, right next to his tent, he came across an enormous paw print. It was in the sand, so the shape wasn't great, but for its size, it couldn't possibly have been left by a dog, and it didn't have any obvious claw prints, suggesting a cat. The picture he took is just ambiguous enough to be inconclusive, but either way, that put him off ever stopping to camp there again. Another time, he woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something scuffing the ground and brushing against his tent. So, scared shitless, he was sure somebody had come to rob him, harm him, or both. Or possibly it was a puma. Thinking fast, he quietly got out of his sleeping bag, unzipped his tent, and stepped outside wearing nothing but his boxers and boots holding a knife. Next to his tent were 2 stray dogs humping, and a third sitting nearby watching silently. He says he exchanged glances with the third dog, shrugged, and went back to sleep. When I was in my early 20s, I had a friend with a psychotic, alcoholic father. She didn't live with him. He lived in a very remote coastal town. Now and again, we would go to visit him and stay the night. My relationship with him was creepy in itself, but that isn't the subject right now. One night when we were visiting, my friend and her dad had a drunken blow-up, and he kicked us out of the house. It was about midnight. We had gotten a lift down and didn't have a car. and my friend's dad lived 4 kilometers out of town, a huddle or two of 3 shops, by way of a dirt road. We started walking down the dirt road to the town, where there was a telephone booth. This was in the days before it was commonplace to have a mobile phone. I was going to call my folks, who lived roughly about an hour and a half away, and see if they would be willing to come and collect us. The whole way to town, my friend was drunkenly moaning and crying about her broken relationship with her father, and she hadn't let up by the time that we got to the phone booth. She sat on a bench next to the phone while I woke up my parents, and they agreed to come get us, and I sat down on the bench for the long wait. Shortly after this, a van appeared and parked just behind the bench that we were sitting on, maybe 5 meters away. There were 2 young men in the front seats, and they were looking directly at us. If that didn't make me nervous enough, the van door slid open, and I saw that there were a number of young guys in the back. I don't remember how many. More than 2 for sure. The place we were sitting was deserted. There were no houses nearby, just more road. No people, nowhere to run, no one driving by. It was a shitty, little, middle-of-nowhere town. I stood up so that I could see them better, and I kept my eyes fixed on the van full of men, acutely aware of our vulnerability. What I saw was that they were looking back at us. They were talking amongst themselves, quietly at first. Then they started talking more and more loudly. It became evident that they were deliberately talking loud enough for us to hear. They were talking about pulling us into their van and taking us somewhere to rape and kill us. I can't remember the exact words, but that was most certainly the gist of it. My whole body was not shaking, but quaking in terror. I couldn't take my eyes off the men. I remember the face of one of them so clearly, I could draw it now. He was just sitting in the door of the van, looking at me with no expression, looking at me with dead eyes, looking at me like I was a thing. All this time, my drunk friend hadn't stopped sobbing to herself. Whether she knew the van was there at all, I couldn't say. I knew I had to tell her about the danger, but I was actually so full of terror I couldn't move, let alone speak. That was when the most incredible thing happened. My friend's father, who has never apologized to anyone in his life, and who was the most awkward prick alive, appeared drunk in his car. It's hard to describe how unlikely it was for him to do this. He could hold a grudge like no one you'd ever met. He was a stubborn son of a bitch, and he and my friend had an emotional reunion. The whole time, my eyes were just fixed on the van. The men had stopped talking and were just watching us. "Let's go," I said. We got back into the car and started heading for my friend's dad's house. The van started up and began to follow us. I tried to explain to my dad's friend about the men, but he said, "I would just slow down and they can pass." They slowed to a crawl behind us, and they began to shout out of the windows, screaming threats. They followed us all the way down that dirt road, and then all the way down the driveway of my friend's dad's house. They just sat in the van behind us, and we sat in the car waiting to see what would happen. All of my friend's dad's neighbours were holiday homes, and nobody was in that night. We knew that if the group of men decided to get out of the van and carry out their threat, we would get no help. After a very long time, The van backed out of the driveway and left. My parents came in a panic to the house when they couldn't find us at the shops, and my friend's dad hid in shame, and I went back to my family's home. I've been asked if I went to the police, but I didn't. I was messed up in so many ways at that point in my life, but that incident changed me forever. I am now a very fearful person, and very overprotective of my own kids, and I don't ever want to change, because I'd rather be like this than accidentally trust one of the millions of psychos out there. Fasten your bootstraps for this one. So a good friend of mine is out on a bike ride with 2 other guys up a creek that runs through our city. As it gets up into the hills, the slopes on the sides get steeper and it turns into a canyon, facing the path up some nasty switchback, up and away from the river. Well, they decide that the switchbacks suck, and that the river is shallow enough to walk up further and explore. They walk up for a while, with the walls of the canyon getting higher and steeper, isolating them further from any easy way in or out. As they start turning a bend in the river, they see a beach to the side, which is formed in a little forested area at the bottom of the walls. They figure they found some awesome new hangout spot, because no one would ever come here. Well, the first of them goes up to the sandy beach to take a piss, and says, guys, you're gonna want to see this. The obvious penis joke ensues, but eventually they walk up the hill, and the first thing they see is a ball gag, followed by a mask and some Gatorade bottles. Next is a massive strap-on, a whip, and some other BDSM gear. Being the mature 20-year-olds they are, they start trying to flick it at each other, and one of them puts the mask on and chases the other around. Then, they notice a path leading into the small forest, and figure that there might be a way all the way back to the main path, and that the gear is just some kid's practical joke. While about halfway down the path, it becomes apparent that this is not the case, and they come out to this 100 square foot sandy area that has been totally cleared of rocks. In the middle of this, about a human wingspan apart, is 2 upright poles stuck to the ground, with eye-hole screws stuck to the top. All the rocks in the area have been carefully placed in a spiral, each with a smaller rock on top placed in the exact center. So they have a look around and don't find anything else, but are pretty weirded out, and make a vow to come back sometime over the next few days. So they decide to go back 2 days later after work, and call me to go along with them. One of the group got off pretty late, and we spend a while getting ready to go buy some time, and we go to the trailhead. The sun is setting, and we brought flashlights, so no worries, right? Skip ahead to us walking up the creek, in the pitch dark, and coming up the site. We're talking pretty loudly, but sound doesn't travel that far over the river sounds, as we're getting nearer. Then, one person in our group shushes us, because he says he heard something. We laugh it off, and tell him to shut the hell up. We know he's just messing with us, but as we're doing that, the rest of us hear it too. It sounded like someone receiving pleasure. It's hard to tell over the sound of the river, but we got a little nervous at that point. We kept walking, and as we come around the bend, we decide that if anyone is there, we don't want to accidentally sneak up on them. So we start making a bunch of noise, saying stuff like, "Oh look, a fascinating rock," after announcing our presence, and we slowly pan our flashlight to the beach. First thing we see, the strap-on is gone, So is the ball gag and Gatorade bottles. Next thing we see is a wet patch on the beach, as though someone had just been lying there. Now this is midsummer, so if anyone had been there during the day, the patch would be dry. We were all getting pretty damn scared about who was there at that point, but we walk up to the beach, but don't get out of the creek, and look around. It's totally clean. All the gear is gone, so we start to point our flashlights into the forest and down the path. We don't see anything, but all of a sudden we hear a loud splunk sound. We look at each other confused, and then hear another one on our side, and closer. Someone was throwing rocks at us. We all take off running as fast as we could down the river, tripping and losing shoes and falling in. Once we get far enough, we break down into an adrenaline-fueled laughter. We haven't gone back since. A few years back, a friend and I were snooping around some allotments in the outskirts of our village in the UK. It was about 11 p.m, so it was pretty dark. Not a completely pitch-black darkness, but dark to the point where if you were to look at a tree around 30 meters away, all you'd see would be its silhouette. But up close, you could see enough to navigate by. The allotment was surrounded on 3 sides by deep hedgerows, with trees, and then fields beyond. I'm always super vigilant in these sort of situations, so generally I'll stop regularly and just listen. You know, just stand as still as possible and strain my ears for people approaching. My friend had crouched down around 3 meters from me to see what sort of plants were growing and was pulling at vegetables that were growing in the soil. While we were listening, I began to hear a noise coming from the back corner of the allotments, about 20 or 30 meters away. The noise was really hard to describe. It was like a low-pitched sound that sounded vividly like someone rampantly speaking in tongues. But it was odd. It kind of seemed smaller than a human voice, but deeper, like an animal, but speaking in tongues. All different vowels and consonant sounds rolling over. It's incredibly hard to describe, but I can remember hearing it vividly, and still can hear it in my mind if I think about it enough. My friend and I had a system of hand signals, but of course he was focused on this plant, and I was utterly convinced that this was going to be one of the things you see or hear, but by the time you got someone's attention, the sound has stopped and no one would believe you for the rest of your life. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to draw attention to myself or my friend, so I just stood stock still and made a short, sharp hiss sound with my tongue. My friend looked up, and I signaled in the direction of the noise. It carried on. My friend and I just stood there and listened, in silence for about a minute, before it started to increase in volume. That was the point, where we decided that we'd done enough investigating. It carried on as we left. As it was a few years ago now, my sane head just says it was some kind of animal, a fox or something. But I spend a lot of time out at night, away from built-up areas, and I've never heard a noise that I could even morph into that. It was just this odd babble of what sounded like made-up words, but coming from a voice box that didn't sound human. At the time, we had all sorts of theories, but we knew it could just be an animal. But there's also a lot of suspicious government installments in the area. Talks of a hidden tunnel network, and if you're out at night, you'll often see a lot of strange lights over the hill in the distance. I know I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but the account is true. As a kid, I'd stay along with my sister at my grandparents' farm in eastern Nebraska, about 7-ish miles south of Ashland. This is about as nowhere as it got for me. I guess until I turned 19 and drove 9 hours to Chardon, Nebraska. That is the middle of nowhere. I think I was about 10 or 11 at the time, but we were staying the night over at my grandparents' farm, as we did, and found out a couple of weeks prior that my grandpa's 2 dogs were acting strangely, and apparently found a feral dog who started acting very alpha. The dog would attack my grandpa's cows and injure them, attack the farm cats for no goddamn reason. So my grandpa was pretty sick of this so-called wild alpha. Being a Nebraska man, my grandpa was the owner of about 3 rifles, and kept plenty of ammo for each as well. It was about 11 p.m. at night, where we heard a loud howl come from the rear of the house. My sister and I were spooked, but my interests got the best of me, and I went to the enclosed porch and looked outside with a flashlight. I saw nothing. Grandpa heard a second howl and noticed it sounded a lot like the alpha. He grabs his 3006, grabs the flashlight from me, and tells me to go back inside the house and watch my sister. 5 minutes later, I hear growling, 2 gunshots, and 5 more minutes pass before my grandpa comes back. Apparently the alpha took off running after my grandpa fired a warning shot. The alpha stopped about 80 yards away, and this being nowhere near a major city and clear-lit moon, my grandpa noticed that the alpha started slowly crawling towards my grandpa from 80 yards out. Grandpa let the alpha get about 50 feet before he shot him, injuring it. The alpha then ran off, and we assumed it died as my grandpa never saw it again. We found out later, this being the reason why I called it the alpha, that this dog had managed to gain my grandpa's rather 2 young dogs' trust, and the younger dogs were spotted before the alpha was shot, with the alpha attacking the cows by one of his neighbours. Grandpa spared the dogs until they started acting funny towards him, and had to put one of them down because it kept trying to attack him old Yeller style. We think the other dog picked up on it. Our university had an abandoned mental facility right next to the halls where we stayed. They were really old, with a big driveway to it, and the grass on either side had grown tall and out of control. As far as we knew, there were security staff to keep people out, but otherwise it was abandoned and derelict. Our campus was extremely isolated, so this mental facility was in the middle of nowhere. Being 19, and living away from home with access to unlimited amount of booze and drugs, of course, we decided to go exploring. It was just a rickety old building. Creepy, but nothing major. That was until my friend fell through the floor. Fortunately, it wasn't a bad fall. Unfortunately, there was an old reclining chair, of the medical sort, with leather restraints and a bunch of old-timey doctor shit lying around. The rest of the room was just dark. He's one of the toughest people I know, but the fear in his eyes was something else, and we got the hell out of there. Word is that there are numerous tunnels that permeate the area from the hospital. Who knows why? We later camped in the woods nearby and found coloured shapes nailed to trees, only periodically. According to the security who worked at the halls, these were marking out search areas for escape from the hospitals. It's fairly high up and isolated in the north of England, so most escapees died of exposure. Most. I live in Alaska, and we have a lot of wilderness up here. Cut the state in half, and it's still larger than Texas. Anyway, the drive from Fairbanks to Anchorage is 6.5 hours long going at 70. It's a very long drive with minimal stops, and you pass a person on the long stretches maybe once every 10 minutes. There is one pass that goes through a beautiful mountainous valley. A lot of people stop off to take pictures, because it's rare to see a sight like that. My girlfriend and I were driving through it, and noticed a silvery dot between two clouds. I thought it was a little cloud, and paid no attention to it at first. But as we kept driving, it stayed in the same spot, but kept getting a little bit larger as we drove. Now we see planes and balloons up here all the time, because it's a great place to do research. But it was neither of these things. When planes move, they actively change reflections based upon their angle to the sun. This was stationary, and also as we moved closer, it looked like an upside down V that was rounded in the middle. Very odd. So I mentioned it to my girlfriend. Do you see that? What do you think it is? As we postulated this for a good 2 minutes, while staring at it, I couldn't figure out what it was. So we pulled over to a brake spot, pulled out my DSLR with a telescopic lens, and were able to see it better. It was as I described previously, and it was clearly made of metal. Every once in a while, I would watch it completely disappear and reappear in random areas around it. Higher, way to the right, then way to the left, and closer to us. There was another couple that stopped too, and they couldn't figure it out either. I'm not a propagator of UFO theories, but this was weird. I've never seen any object in the sky like this before. It was odd. It never moved unless it disappeared from sight. No towns around for hundreds of miles. And the shape? I don't know. I'm glad my girl was with me, because I would have no idea how to back up this weird claim otherwise. I'm a geologist, but thankfully, I've never experienced anything weird while out in the middle of the Canadian nowhere. However, when I was a teenager, I was in Air Cadets in the UK, and every Friday, we'd usually do some kind of exercise out on the village common. It wasn't remote, because there were houses dotted around the perimeter, but it was quite a large area, so most of the time, the houses were out of eyesight. Anyway, this one particular Friday in winter, we had to do an exercise on a different place. This place was absolutely isolated. I think there was a circus on the common, so we had to make do. It was dark already, but there was a full moon, so we didn't need to use our torches. They're red filtered, so I never found them too helpful anyway. We were supposed to be collecting markers for different points, but we were allowed to steal markers from other groups, and whichever group had the most at the end of the exercise would win. Our group decided we wouldn't do any work and just ambush other groups and steal theirs. We were hiding behind some thorn bushes when everything got really quiet and eerie. All the whispered conversations in our groups just stopped, and everything just got really quiet and eerie. I remember it feeling very tense, but I wasn't sure why. About 5 seconds later, this big, black shape emerged from the bushes on top of the hill that we were on. It was particularly silhouetted by the full moon, and it looked to be about the size of a dog, based on the size of the bushes, but it walked like a cat, because it was slinking around. Halfway across the path, it just stopped, and I'm guessing it looked towards us. I couldn't actually see its face because it was dark, but I couldn't see the profile of its face for any longer. It froze there for about 10 seconds, before slinking its way into the bushes on the other side of the path. Once we couldn't see it anymore, I swear everyone started breathing again, and we were all like, "Oh my God, did you just see that?" And then another group came running up to us. We thought they were going to ambush us and steal markers we didn't have, but they'd seen it too. We all left and headed back to the camp after that. This was in Ewes Harold. I'm not 100% sure what I saw, but I'm thinking it was one of the giant cats, panthers, that are rumoured to roam the area. They don't get seen that often, and most videos of them are dismissed. But the Hereford Times occasionally runs articles about farm animals being eaten, and how the paw prints in the area belonged to a cat species that are far too big to be domestic. A year or two ago, my boyfriend and his cousin's friend decided to do a 3 to 4 day hike. We planned to do about 15 miles a day and camp out at night. We were so excited, but not prepared for the heavy pack we would have to carry. So the first day goes okay, and we're all exhausted, and my boyfriend and I realize how out of shape we are as we struggle with the heavy packs. We wake up, and my boyfriend's cousin tells us that he could have sworn he saw flashlights and heard people walking around our campsite, which made us nervous, because we didn't see almost anyone as we hiked the first day. This has nothing to do with the story, but still, something that I found creepy. The second day, we start hiking again, and we slowly make our way, realizing we will not be hiking as far as we would hope, when my boyfriend starts complaining about his foot. His toe is now starting to turn black, I guess from the bruising of his boot while we walked downhill. Now, what we are trying to figure out is how we're going to make it to the nearest road and get back to the car. After what seems like forever trying to get back to the road using a map, and having to cross a river like the mountain men and women, we are, finally, able to make it to the road. Now the problem is finding the way back to the car, which is most likely miles away from where we were, when a pickup truck pulls over and asks if we need help. We say yes, and we need to find our car, and ask them which way is the road. They offer a ride, and look at us individually and say, "We'll take the girl," with straight faces. Now I'm not the best looking girl in the world by any means, and especially now, I was extra gross from living in the forest for a day and a half. My group all say, "No, you're not." So my boyfriend and his cousin decide to go with them, since there wasn't enough room for everyone. They open the truck door, and out pour empty beer cans, and we don't have a good feeling about this. But they go anyway, with their hatchets on their belts, just in case. So now my friend and I are sitting on the side of the road, when I say, "What if they don't come back?" To which my friend says he memorized their license plate just in case. He is a smart guy, that one. Eventually, though, they come and pick us up in our car, telling us how these guys were speeding down these narrow roads and being extremely reckless. Thank God they made it back in one piece. The hike was a fail, but at least we're still alive, right? I am a former Philmont Ranger. For those of you who don't know, Philmont is the Boy Scouts' 138,000 acre high adventure base in Nowhere, New Mexico. On a day off, 2 of my fellow Rangers and myself decided to bag 12 peaks in a 24-hour hike. The planned route was almost 50 miles, and we had to pre-position water and snacks at one point due to lack of water in this area that was closed to campers. We set off, and the hike was going great. Fast forward to 2:30 a.m. 18 hours into the hike, and we're just getting off Black Mountain and finished a 2,000-meter descent, which was wicked steep, and all scree. We have 2 headlamps between us, since mine had burnt out an hour ago. We walk out along a ridge with a few feet of trees on either side before it drops off, and after about half a mile, my friend notices a big pair of glowing eyes behind us. It's a mountain lion, no doubt about it. It's about this time that we realize it's early morning, and that's exactly when they like to feed. We decide to make a lot of noise and keep walking down the trail. We only make it a few feet before we see a different set of eyes to our right. Another mountain lion. Shit. This is weird. They never hunt together. Now we grab our pocket knives in one hand and rocks in the other. We're convinced that they're going to attack. We walk a little further, and a third pair of eyes pops out to our left. We're screwed now. One of my buds starts chucking rocks at the one of our left, and after 2 tries, nails it in the head. I assume it's a bit hard to tell in the dark, and it lets out the most terrifying, blood-curdling scream you've ever heard. But none of the 3 mountain lions leave. Again, this is strange to us, since most animals will flee when they hunt, unless they're sick, starving, or protecting their young. We decide to make more noise, and settle on singing a song. We somehow picked Call Me Maybe, and proceeded to belt that out to the mountain lions. No dice. We are walking in a triangle formation, all facing outwards so nobody's back is exposed. And after the longest 2 miles of my life, we eventually came out to a clearing where we found a camp. We went to the cabin and collapsed on the porch and took a quick 20-minute power nap before continuing the hike and finishing at 23 hours, 57 minutes and 32 seconds. Turns out that portion of the park had been closed because of mountain lion breeding. Apparently, we stumbled upon parents teaching their cubs to hunt. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed today's adventures in the middle of nowhere. I know I certainly did. And if you did, share the love, drop that like, hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to press the little bell icon for good measure. You know you don't want to miss an upload. And why not go ahead and drop a sweet comment down below with your thoughts on this video. They're always read and always incredibly appreciated, as they go a long way in helping me defeat that pesky YouTube algorithm one day at a time. If you have a story that you wish to share and would like it read on Mortis Media, all that you need to do is drop me an email or send it to my Reddit. That alone is enough. But for an added bonus, it would mean a lot if you would paragraph your stories, make sure to add plenty of punctuation, and finally, add lots and lots of description, because it makes the story easier for me to read and makes it easier to listen to as well. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. There's a tent with my name on it in the middle of nowhere. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.